What's up, plant lovers? I'm Devin Wallin, and perhaps you searched for how to create your garden from scratch, or you're looking to revamp your garden because you're just not quite, you don't love how it looks right now. Well, as a landscape designer here in Westchester, Pennsylvania, as well as being in the horticultural trade with my family for the last 4 generations, if someone were to ask me, what are the artistic qualities about plants that I personally look for when I'm selecting this plant to go here or there, combining plants together? Well, those are some of the questions that we're going to be addressing in this video. I have a previous video about the logistical side of things that you should look for, like lighting, water, your USDA zone, things like that. And you can find a link to that video in the description below. Of course, now these are my artistic perspectives. You might not share all of them, and that's the beauty of gardening. We all have our own look, our own love. But regardless, I promise you that with the recommendations in this video, you can go forth with confidence to create the garden of your dreams, and you can do it all by yourself. And so the first thing, let's just start with, the most basic thing that most people go to, and that's flowers. Flowers shouldn't be the first thing you think about because flowers are fleeting. There's some old phrase like flowers are for a day, but foliage is to stay. And that should be the first thing that you think about, the foliage of your plants. So when we're talking about foliage, let's start with the foliage shape. There's lots of different shapes out there. You can think of things like an oak leaf versus a maple leaf, different shapes, but there's also different sizes. There's big leaves, there's small leaves, there's strap-like leaves, there's compound leaves, all of these different sorts of leaf shapes that when they're growing together, we want to be thinking about what the shapes of a leaf of this plant looks like next to the shape of leaf of this plant next to it. We don't necessarily want to have two strap-like grassy sort of foliage next to each other. That doesn't always seem to work. They kind of actually end up competing with one another. But maybe you have a really unique shaped foliage next to the grassy style foliage and they just sort of harmonize together. Because that's what we're going to see for the majority of the year. Even if they're deciduous plants that lose their foliage in the wintertime, you're still going to have that foliage on the plant from spring till late autumn. And if you do live where the weather stays warm all year round, well, even more of a reason to be focusing on that foliage. Now, not only should we be thinking about the foliage shape, we also want to think about foliage color. There's a lot of foliage, if you can correct me if I'm not saying it how you like, but tomato, tomato. I'm from Indiana, and that's how we speak in Indiana. So foliage color, we have a deep green, we have light greens, we have chartreuses, we even have purples, some more are going to be reds. So now you're starting to bring color into the equation, but from the actual leaves, because it's, like I mentioned, this is what's going to be providing you with that visual impact for a much longer time in the year. When we don't want to just have a bunch of rich green colored plants. Yeah, maybe that's like 80% of the plants, but maybe we want to sprinkle in, a nice yellow foliage plant or a nice purple foliage plant or a red foliage plant. Those are going to really start to create that unique interest in your garden, and it's going to set your garden apart from Joe and Jane down the street. Most people just garden with green. Why not add a little bit of spice to the mix with different colored leaves? And the last thing that I like to think about when it comes to the leaves are whether or not, if you're like me and you have winters, I live in Westchester, Pennsylvania, zone 6B, I need to think about, do I have enough plants that are going to retain those leaves all year round? We call those evergreens. There's 2 different kinds of evergreens. There's coniferous evergreens. That's going to be things like our pine trees, our spruces, our fir trees. They have the needles. Or are they going to be broadleaf evergreens? That's more of a traditional leaf sort of look of a plant. And that's going to be things like hollies or our cherry laurels. So we need to be consistently thinking about that composition, the proportion of plants that are going to be evergreen all year round, or plants that lose their foliage in the wintertime, which we call deciduous. Now, it should be noted that most evergreen plants, if they do produce any flowers whatsoever, it's going to be very, very minimal. So those plants, we add them to the garden for structure. They're going to create that structure that remains in the garden all year round, since they do have color, green, all year round. Now that we are starting to think about our plants a little bit differently than the traditional way, the next thing that we want to think about is the actual form, or in the world of horticulture, we call this the habit of the plant. Is it an upright growing plant like a canna lily? Is it a viburnum that kind of has like a vase shape as it grows? Is it a rounded, mounded plant? Is it a spreading ground cover? You don't want to, you don't want 10 rounded, mounded boxwoods all next to each other and have, that's your entire garden. Unless you're going for a very traditional kind of garden, in my opinion, that's a little bit boring. We want to have variety of the plant form. And we want to start thinking about how those forms really mix and mingle together. So it can be really nice to have a rounded, mounded plant next to an upright plant. But I don't necessarily want to put a really upright plant next to a vase-shaped plant, because they might kind of look weird growing into one another. So we're starting to visualize how these plants are going to grow and evolve in our garden. The plants that we buy at the store are going to be small. We need to be thinking about the future. That's what gardening is. We're always looking out into the future, 5, 10 years, planning for the future. So thinking about the plant form is going to be the next step to really developing a wonderful garden planting at your home. Now, kind of along that lines, one of the most important kinds of plants that we can be adding into our garden would be woody plants. Those are plants that are producing woody stems at the base of the plant. And the reason why that's so important, whether they are deciduous and they lose their foliage in the wintertime, or they're evergreen and retain that foliage all winter, the fact is they are going to provide structure in the garden all year round. That visual interest in the wintertime is beautiful. A hydrangea that loses all of its leaves and flowers, maybe you leave the old flowers on your hydrangea during the winter, but just the shape of that beautiful shrub in the wintertime is something for the eyes to rest on. We don't want to have just a bunch of we call them herbaceous perennials. Those are plants that die back all the way to the ground, and you got to cut them back in the springtime to let them regrow. Woody plants, we don't do that with. We just let them get bigger, generally, assuming we've planned correctly for the spacing, we let them get bigger each year, and they're going to provide the bulk of the order to your garden. If you have a bed that is just a bunch of herbaceous plants, what often happens, it looks really disorganized and a little bit, without any sort of distinct order, because those herbaceous plants, they tend to get, at the end of the season, they get floppy, they might not hold, they're kind of melding into one another. But if you can add in some woody plants to the mix, it's going to really visually help lift the energy of that garden and make it just feel much cleaner. It can still have a very natural appearance about it. That's how I garden, very natural, but I want to have it visually clean and not cluttered. And woody plants are the best way to do that. So at this point, we're really focused on the structure of our garden, and that is the most essential thing to really start with. Now, once you have a good structure, then we can really start adding in the thoughts about flower colors, whether you want to have some sort of, all pink flowered garden, or you want to have, a contrasting purple and yellow flowered garden during the month of July. Now we can start to add in some of that more like finessing, using specific plants for their flower colors at a specific time. So of course you can start thinking about matching the flower colors, like a yellow flowered rose with a purple lavender that are going to bloom at about the same time. That's really nice. But also matching the flower color of one plant to the foliage color of another plant. For instance, a foxglove that produces those lovely pink blooms next to some of our silvery purple foliage coral bells. So now we're starting to mix and match colors of the flowers together, but also with the foliage of the plants around them. It can also help you to refrain from doing certain things, like having an apricot colored rose with a bright chartreuse yellow Lysomachia nummularia creeping Jenny because those colors tend to clash. So we're starting to think about how colors in the garden are melding together, blending together, trying to refrain from, clashing. And this is a slow process. So don't think, there's a lot to think about here. Just take it one step at a time. And next we can start to think about the shape of the flowers. I don't necessarily want to have a garden with a bunch of daisy-shaped blooms. That gets kind of boring. I could have my gaillardia with my Gerber daisies and my echinacea and my black-eyed Susan and all the flowers. Maybe they're all different colors and that's cool, but they're all the same shape. And that's like, I get bored. And you probably will too. So starting to mix different shapes of flowers together, seeing how they work together, seeing how they look together can really create a lot of visual interest. And the last sort of aspect to think about the logistics of the flowers would be the bloom time, of course. Are these plants that you're thinking about adding are you going to place them in the garden where they're going to bloom at the same time as a bunch of other plants are blooming, or is it going to be like the only plant in that garden bed blooming at one time? It can be really lovely to have a bed full of a lot of different flowers blooming, but it can also be really lovely to have a bed with just one kind of plant blooming. Is this plant going to fill the gap that you might be experiencing in a specific garden bed? That's the next thing to be thinking about. It can also be nice to think about, do these flowers make for good cut flowers? And that might sound silly. Oh yeah, every flower looks good cut. A lot of them do, but if you cut that flower off, is it going to produce new flowers on that same stem, or is it going to just be done once you cut that flower? So like a plant like a zinnia, you're going to cut and cut and cut, and it's going to continue to bloom all season long. But if you have that beautiful hydrangea and it has 5 flowers, and you want to cut one, well, you might not get any more flowers off that hydrangea. And that could be a real bummer. Another thing that I really like to have in my garden is plants that are fragrant. Of course, I have my roses and lavender, which produce lovely fragrant flowers, but I also have catmint that produces lovely fragrant foliage. Fragrance comes from both flowers and foliage. So thinking about how to add in plants with fragrance might be something you're interested in, or it might be something you want to stay away from. Maybe the smells that bother you, they give you allergies, whatever. But fragrance is, of course, something to always be thinking about. But it's kind of like an added bonus. Unless we're talking about a rose. I would never plant a rose that's not fragrant. I don't have time for roses that aren't fragrant, because fragrance of the rose is, I think, the best fragrance in the world. So we were briefly mentioning this aspect earlier, which is winter interest, and how woody plants create a lot of winter interest. But woody plants aren't the only plants that do such. There are others that will do it. Something like a black-eyed Susan or an echinacea coneflower that leave old flower heads on your plants, that looks really beautiful. Or a lot of grasses. Some people cut their grasses off, or cut their grasses down kind of at the end of autumn. I always wait till the end of winter, because even though they look dead, they still look beautiful. So is your plant going to provide any sort of winter interest, or is it just going to be totally blank, leaving an empty hole and gaps in your garden bed? It's inevitable, like if you live where you have winters like I do, that you are going to have gaps. So don't try to just plant plants that just have winter interest, then your garden will probably have minimal summer interest, which is why most of us garden, but it's something to think about. If you live somewhere like I do in Pennsylvania, you need to be thinking about deer resistance, pest resistance, things like that. I have an awesome video that kind of breaks down deer resistance. Find a link to that video in the description below. It kind of gives, like, rather than necessarily a list per se, it gives it does have a good list, but it also really breaks down. There are certain characteristics of plants that will make them deer resistant. And if you have a good understanding, you don't need to have a list in your back pocket when you go to the garden center. You can really just start to understand if that plant will resist deers or not. So I think that's a pretty nice video on that topic. Another thing that you might really want to be, growing are edible plants. I don't need to tell you how fun it is to eat a homegrown tomato. I don't even have a raised beds. I just do maybe 5 or 6 large containers full of veggies, tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and that's good enough for me. One day I might put a raised bed in or something like that, but edibility is definitely a factor that you should be considering. Some edible plants, like a strawberry, can also provide some decent garden interest the rest of the year with lovely foliage. Now I saved the last for maybe one of the most important things to consider, Is this plant native to your region or not? This is a huge topic. I have lots of videos on native plants. Particularly if you live in the mid-Atlantic like I do, I have some really great videos. I'll put some links in the description below on visits to some inspiring native plant gardens in this area, and I'll give some good plant lists as well. But we should all be planting more natives. It's just logical. It's a good thing to do because it's going to help to restore your soils. It's going to provide pollen to our beneficial insects in a form that is accessible to them. Plants that we import from overseas and we plant, like a peony for instance, sure, it's going to have flowers with pollen, but that pollen might not be like digestible to the local beneficial insects in your region. So is that pollen even worthwhile? I always try to aim for at least 50% native plants in my garden beds. And I think that's like a realistic number because I still want to have things like roses and hydrangea and clematis, beautiful blooming plants. Also, native plants just tend to be lower maintenance, easier plants to grow, less demanding, and they tend to match the energy of your setting very well. So it's really easy to incorporate native plants into your garden schemes, into your garden planning. So that's absolutely something that you should think about if you haven't started to think about yet. And that's about it. That's all I got. I think that's a pretty long list. We're like 20 minutes in right now, and hopefully this gets your mind jogging for this spring season when we're heading out to the garden centers and thinking about plants to add to our flower beds, or maybe you're thinking about creating a new shrub border. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like. If you have any other things that I didn't think about, leave it in the comment section below. Pardon me. Not just for me, but for the other gardeners in the community. The comment sections tend to be pretty full of great information from fellow gardeners, and that's why they exist. Anyways, thanks for joining me here on Plant Vibrations. I'll catch you guys later. Ciao.